The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, clinging to the mourners like an unshakable weight. The dim light of the chapel flickered against the polished wood of the casket, where Caleb Quinn lay in eternal silence. His passing had gathered the family together for the first time in years, yet grief was not the only thing present in the room. Beneath the quiet sobs and whispered condolences, something else lurked. Something sharp. Something waiting to be unleashed. And then, it happened. A voice, cold and laced with venom, cut through the solemn air. "You don't actually believe you have any right to his inheritance, do you?" A single sentence. A spark in a room filled with unspoken tension. What followed was not mourning. It was war. "Stay. You're about to witness the unraveling of a family built on lies." The scent of lilies was overwhelming. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating, mixing with the faint traces of candle wax and polished wood. Outside, the Seattle rain drizzled against the stained glass windows, casting fragmented colors across the rows of mourners dressed in black. The chapel was silent, save for the occasional rustle of fabric, or the muffled sound of someone holding back a sob. At the front of the room, the mahogany casket gleamed under the dim light. Caleb Quinn lay inside, forever still, his presence reduced to nothing but whispered condolences and the weight of unspoken words. Ivy Quinn sat near the back, hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart was a steady thud in her chest, a painful rhythm that she couldn't ignore. She had known this day was coming. She had tried to prepare for it. And yet, nothing could have truly readied her for the hollow ache settling inside her bones. She let her gaze drift forward, scanning the familiar faces of the Quinn family. Her adoptive parents, Daniel and Elaine, sat a few pews ahead, their expressions composed but weary. Distant relatives, she barely recognized, whispered to one another in hushed tones. And then, there was Sienna. Sienna Quinn sat in the front row, her posture as perfect as ever, her dark eyes dry. She hadn't shed a single tear. Not during the eulogy, not during the final hymn, not even when the priest spoke of Caleb's enduring legacy. Instead, she sat with her chin lifted high, exuding an air of silent authority. But Ivy knew her too well. That wasn't grief on her face. That was something else entirely. When the final prayer was spoken and the service concluded, the mourners slowly rose from their seats, murmuring their goodbyes, as they made their way out of the chapel. Ivy stayed seated for a moment longer, staring at the casket, trying to gather herself. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps until it was too late. "You don't actually believe you have any right to his inheritance, do you?" The voice was smooth, laced with venom, each syllable dripping with condescension. Ivy stiffened. She closed her eyes for half a second before turning. Sienna stood beside her, arms crossed, her lips curved into something that might have been a smirk if they weren't at a funeral. Her black coat hugged her frame perfectly, the deep red of her lipstick almost too bold for the somber occasion. Ivy inhaled slowly, keeping her voice steady. "This isn't the time for this, Sienna." Sienna arched a perfectly shaped brow. "Oh, I think it is. Because I need to make one thing very clear to you." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't belong here." Ivy felt the words like a slap, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she met Sienna's gaze head-on. "I was just as much his granddaughter as you were." Sienna let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't fool yourself. You weren't his granddaughter. You were his charity project. A little orphan girl he took in because it made him feel good about himself. But blood? That's something you'll never have." Ivy's nails dug into the fabric of her dress, but her voice remained even. "Family isn't about blood. It's about love. And he loved me." Sienna's eyes flashed with something sharp, something dangerous. "Loved you," she repeated, tilting her head. If he really loved you, don't you think he would have made it clear in his will? Ivy's stomach twisted, but she didn't let her composure slip. He did make it clear. I was just as much a part of this family as you were. And no matter what you say, that won't change. Sienna's lips curled into something resembling disgust. You don't get it, do you? You were a guest in our home. A guest who overstayed her welcome. Ivy's pulse pounded, but she refused to break. You can believe whatever you want, Sienna. But I know the truth. Grandpa knew the truth. That's what matters. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed across Sienna's face. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She exhaled sharply, straightening her coat. We'll see about that, she murmured before turning on her heel and walking away. Ivy sat there, unmoving, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had come here to say goodbye. Instead, she had just stepped onto a battlefield. Ivy's earliest memories were wrapped in warmth. The scent of old books in Caleb's study, the soft notes of the grand piano echoing through the Quinn estate, the deep timbre of his voice as he told stories of the family's history. She wasn't born into the Quinn name. She had no blood ties to the lineage that stretched back generations. But Caleb never let her feel like an outsider. She was 6 when Daniel and Elaine Quinn adopted her. The vast estate felt overwhelming at first, the endless hallways, the grand chandeliers, the way voices echoed in the cavernous dining hall. She had never belonged anywhere before. But then, there was Caleb. Come here, little one, he had said on her first night, patting the space beside him in the study. Let's make a deal. I'll tell you a story if you promise to tell me one in return. And so it began. He taught her how to read beyond the words, to see the history behind them. He placed her tiny hands on the piano keys and told her that music was just another way to tell a story. He brought her to Quinn family gatherings, where she stood among people with the same sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes, people who never said it aloud, but made it clear she didn't quite belong. Sienna was the worst of them. She had never been cruel outright, not in a way that left bruises or drew blood. But her words were sharper than knives, each one crafted to remind Ivy of what she was. He dotes on you because he pities you, Sienna had whispered once at a family dinner, her nails digging into Ivy's wrist under the table. He needs something to fix. That's all you are, a project. Ivy had clenched her fists under the table, refusing to react. But Caleb had seen the tension in her shoulders that night. People who are truly secure in their place don't need to push others down, he had told her later, as he traced lazy patterns on the rim of his whiskey glass. You have nothing to prove, my dear. Least of all to her. She had believed him. She had to. But now, sitting in the cold, sterile office of a lawyer, waiting to hear the final words of the man who had raised her, Ivy wondered if she had been naive. The office smelled of paper and polished wood, the air thick with tension. Ivy sat across from Sienna, who had chosen the seat closest to the lawyer's desk, as if proximity alone could grant her power. Patrick Quinn, Sienna's father, sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man of few words, but his silence today carried a weight that felt suffocating. Harrison Cole, the family's lawyer, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. I'll get straight to it, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Caleb Quinn's estate has been divided equally between his 2 granddaughters, Ivy Quinn and Sienna Quinn. The room went still. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, excuse me. Sienna's voice was sharp, her fingers tightening against the armrest of her chair. Harrison didn't look up from the document. Per Mr. Quinn's wishes, the estate, including financial assets, properties, and investments, will be split 50-50 between both beneficiaries. Sienna let out a short, bitter laugh. That's not possible. There has to be a mistake. There's no mistake, Harrison replied. This is absurd. Sienna snapped, turning to her father. Dad, say something. Patrick's jaw was clenched, his fingers drumming against his knee. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. This isn't right. Ivy exhaled slowly, keeping her posture straight. Grandpa made his choice. Just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's wrong. Sienna's head snapped toward her, eyes flashing with fury. You don't get to talk about what's right and wrong. You aren't even a real Quinn. Ivy felt the words hit like a slap, but she refused to let them show. Mr. Cole, Patrick interjected, his voice firm, there must be legal grounds to contest this. My father would never put an outsider on equal footing with his own blood. Harrison hesitated. There is one final item. He reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small, aged envelope. Caleb left this letter specifically for Ivy, he said, sliding it across the desk toward her. His instructions were clear. It is to be opened only in the event of a family dispute regarding the inheritance. Ivy stared at the envelope. Sienna's scoff broke the silence. Oh, how convenient. Ivy ignored her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the letter. The paper was old, the ink faded, but Caleb's handwriting was unmistakable. She took a deep breath and unfolded the letter. Ivy, my dear. If you're reading this, then I suspect my passing has brought out the worst in our family. I'm sorry for that. But I need you to know the truth. The Quinn name has always been about legacy. Bloodlines. Inheritance. But what if I told you that none of it is real? Ivy's pulse quickened as she scanned the next lines. I was not born a Quinn. I was an orphan, taken in by this family as a child. I built my place in this name, but I was never part of its bloodline. And Patrick? Her breath caught. Patrick is not my biological son. He, too, was adopted. Which means Sienna is no more a Quinn by blood than you are. The room blurred at the edges. What does it say? Sienna demanded. Ivy swallowed hard, gripping the paper like a lifeline. You want to talk about bloodlines, Sienna, she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. She lifted her gaze to meet her cousin's. Grandpa wasn't a Quinn by blood. And neither is your father. Which means you're just as much an outsider as I am. Silence crashed over the room like a tidal wave. Sienna's expression flickered, confusion, denial, then rage. Liar. Ivy placed the letter on the desk and slid it toward Patrick. See for yourself. Patrick hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached for the paper, his fingers trembling. As his eyes moved over the words, his face drained of color. No, he whispered. This isn't possible. But it was. Everything Sienna had ever used against Ivy, every cruel remark, every condescending glance, had just crumbled beneath the weight of the truth. They were both standing on the same broken foundation. Ivy exhaled, a slow, steady breath. She had spent years trying to prove that she belonged. Now, for the first time, she realized she had never been the one who needed to prove anything. The courtroom was colder than Ivy had expected. Not in temperature, but in the way the walls felt sterile, in the way the silence pressed down on her chest like an unbearable weight. The Quinn name had been spoken in halls of power, in business meetings, in grand estates dripping with wealth. But today, it was being dragged through a legal battle like any other common dispute, ugly, ruthless, and personal. Sienna sat across from her, sharp in a navy blue suit that likely cost more than some people's yearly salaries. Her expression was calm, but her clenched jaw and the way her manicured fingers tapped rhythmically against the table betrayed her fury. Patrick sat beside her, his shoulders stiff, his face devoid of emotion. Ivy swallowed the tight knot in her throat and turned her attention to her own side of the room. Her lawyer, Evelyn Hart, flipped through the legal documents with the ease of a woman who had seen battles like this before. She had warned Ivy, this wouldn't be about the law. It would be about perception. About who could convince the court that they deserved to win. The judge entered, an older man with a gaze that could cut through steel. The room stood, then sat again as the trial began. Harrison Cole was the first to speak, clearing his throat as he addressed the court. The last will and testament of Caleb Quinn is clear. He wished for his estate to be divided equally between his two granddaughters, Ivy Quinn and Sienna Quinn. However, the plaintiffs, Sienna Quinn and Patrick Quinn, are contesting this on the grounds that Ivy is not a biological heir. Sienna's lawyer, Robert Klein, stood smoothly. Your Honor, this is not a matter of personal bias. The Quinn estate is a legacy that has been passed down for generations. Bloodline has always determined succession, and Miss Ivy Quinn does not meet this criterion. We argue that her claim to half of the inheritance is invalid. Ivy's hands curled into fists. Evelyn stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the judge. Your Honor, the plaintiffs are arguing a point that is both outdated and legally irrelevant. Caleb Quinn's will is explicit. He named both granddaughters as equal heirs. Additionally, we have evidence that Mr. Patrick Quinn, Sienna's father, was not a biological heir himself, making Sienna's argument about bloodline completely baseless. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Patrick shifted uncomfortably, but Sienna didn't even flinch. She had always been good at masking her emotions, until she wasn't. The judge turned to Robert Klein. Is this true? Was Patrick Quinn not biologically related to Caleb Quinn? Klein hesitated for half a second too long. That is irrelevant, he said finally. Evelyn didn't let him breathe. Irrelevant. The plaintiff's entire case hinges on the idea that inheritance is dictated by blood. But if Patrick Quinn, Sienna's own father, was also adopted, then that argument collapses entirely. Silence. Then Sienna spoke, her voice even but laced with steel. That doesn't change the fact that he was raised as a Quinn. That my grandfather built this family's wealth with the understanding that his legacy would be preserved by his bloodline. She turned to Ivy, her dark eyes locking onto her like a predator staring down its prey. He took you in because he felt sorry for you. He took my father in because he chose to. There's a difference. Ivy forced herself to stay calm, even as her nails dug into the skin of her palms. If Grandpa didn't think I belonged, he wouldn't have put my name in the will, she said, her voice quiet but firm. You can't rewrite his decisions, just because you don't like them. Sienna let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Oh, please, she said, leaning forward. Do you really think he saw you as an equal? He might have cared about you, but he wouldn't have wanted you to take half of what he built. That letter you keep holding on to, it's just words. And words don't hold up in court. Ivy's lawyer smirked. Actually, they do. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, along with the letter, Caleb Quinn left behind a sealed box containing official documents proving the truth of his adoption, Patrick Quinn's adoption, and his written confirmation that he viewed Ivy as an equal heir. If the plaintiffs wish to argue intent, then the court must consider this evidence as Caleb Quinn's final say on the matter. The judge glanced at the sealed box placed on the evidence table. He let out a slow breath before turning to Sienna's lawyer. Mr. Klein, do you wish to contest this evidence? Klein hesitated again. Then, finally, he sighed. No, Your Honor. And just like that, the weight shifted. The judge's gavel slammed down. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The will stands as written. The inheritance is to be split equally between Ivy Quinn and Sienna Quinn. Case dismissed. The hallway outside the courtroom was empty except for the two of them. Sienna stood with her back against the wall, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't speak at first. Just stared at the floor, as if absorbing the reality she had tried so hard to deny. Ivy wasn't sure what she expected, a final outburst, a bitter insult, something. But when Sienna finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "You could have told me." Ivy's brow furrowed. "What?" Sienna looked up, her dark eyes burning. "About my father. About the adoption. You let me stand in there like an idiot, thinking I had something you didn't. Thinking I was better than you." Ivy exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Would you have believed me?" Silence. Then, after a long pause, Sienna let out a slow breath. "I don't lose," she murmured. "You just did." Ivy met her gaze, not with triumph, but with something else. Something quieter. "And maybe that's a good thing." Sienna scoffed, but it lacked the venom of before. She turned as if to leave, then hesitated. Without a word, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, placing it into Ivy's hand. Ivy looked down. A fountain pen. Caleb's old, weathered fountain pen, the one he had always carried with him, the one he had once told her he would leave to his favorite grandchild. She looked back up, stunned. Sienna didn't say anything. She just nodded, then walked away. For the first time, Ivy saw something in her cousin's face that wasn't hatred. It wasn't quite acceptance. But it was a start. The Quinn estate in Seattle felt different now. The weight of the past still clung to its walls, but the tension that had suffocated Ivy for so long had finally begun to lift. It was hers now. The grand house with its towering oak bookshelves, the lingering scent of Caleb's pipe smoke woven into the leather chairs, the piano in the parlor where he had once guided her small fingers across the keys, it all belonged to her. Feels strange, doesn't it? Ivy turned from the large window to see Sienna standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "A little," Ivy admitted. "I keep expecting him to walk in, complain about the dust, and lecture me on the importance of upkeep." Sienna let out a soft scoff. "Sounds about right." Silence settled between them. It wasn't the sharp-edged silence that had existed before, the kind filled with unspoken resentment. This was different. Quieter. Almost tentative. "So, you got what you wanted," Ivy said, eyeing Sienna carefully. Sienna arched an eyebrow. "The California house." "Yeah. Not exactly what I came here for, but I won't complain." She tilted her head, a hint of a smirk playing at her lips. "At least I won't have to deal with this rainy hellhole anymore." Ivy shook her head with a small laugh. "And the collection?" she asked, referring to Caleb's vast assortment of architectural blueprints, models, and sketches, the legacy of a man who had dedicated his life to preserving history. Sienna's smirk faded. "I didn't want it sitting in some private vault, collecting dust," she said, her voice quieter. "Neither did you. The university will take care of it better than we ever could." Ivy studied her cousin carefully. The Sienna she had grown up with, the girl who had always wanted more, who had never been satisfied with what she had, would never have agreed to that. "That was the right choice," Ivy said finally. Sienna rolled her eyes. "Don't get used to hearing that from me." Ivy smiled. Maybe she wouldn't. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something different. Days passed. The estate was quiet, filled only with the echoes of the past. Ivy was sitting in the study, surrounded by stacks of Caleb's books, when a knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock, it was late. Curious, she got up and opened the door. Sienna stood there, shifting her weight slightly. Ivy blinked. "You lost." Sienna sighed. "Hilarious." Before Ivy could respond, Sienna reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small. A fountain pen. Ivy froze. She recognized it immediately, the deep mahogany barrel, the gold engraving along the side. Caleb's favorite pen. The one he had carried with him everywhere. "He was going to leave this to you," Sienna said, holding it out. Said it belonged to the grandchild he cherished most or some sentimental bullshit like that. Ivy hesitated. "Why are you giving it to me?" Sienna exhaled sharply, like she had asked herself the same question. "Because it was his," she muttered. "And because maybe I was wrong." Ivy's breath hitched slightly, but she took the pen carefully, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "That's as close to an apology as you're ever going to get," Sienna added, crossing her arms. Ivy smiled. "I'll take it." Sienna glanced away, then sighed. "All right. I did my good deed. I'm going before this gets too emotional." "Sienna." She paused, looking back at Ivy. "Thank you." Sienna didn't reply. But for the first time, her eyes held something that wasn't anger or competition. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Ivy watched her go, the pen still clutched in her hand. That night, Ivy sat by the window of the study, the rain tapping softly against the glass. She turned the pen between her fingers, lost in thought. This house, this inheritance, it had never been about wealth or status. Caleb had known the truth long before any of them had. That family wasn't about blood. It was about love. About choice. Sienna had spent her whole life believing she had something Ivy never would. And yet, in the end, they were the same. Ivy smiled softly, leaning back in her chair, the pen resting in her palm. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love and the choices we make. And for the first time in a long, long while, she felt at peace.